Xylar. Imagine a planet almost entirely covered in water, not unlike our own Earth, but colder, darker, and significantly more organized. This wasn't the kind of place where shimmering coral reefs teemed with life in a chaotic ballet of nature. No, Xylar was a world of order, a testament to the bureaucratic precision of its inhabitants, the Gillocrats. The Gillocrats were essentially fish, but not just any fish. Picture a species evolved to wear tiny, meticulously polished eyeglasses perched on their snouts. Their scales gleamed with military precision, each one perfectly aligned, and their gills pulsed with the rhythmic efficiency of a well-oiled machine. These weren't your average, gurgling, forgetful goldfish. Their society was a marvel of aquatic engineering and regulatory oversight. Colossal, transparent tubes crisscrossed the ocean depths, forming highways for their submersibles, each one adhering to a strict timetable enforced by the Bureau of Subaquatic Transit. Buildings, shimmering bioluminescent structures, rose from the seabed, housing countless departments dedicated to the minutiae of Gillocrat life. The Department of Approved Algae Consumption, the Office of Standardized Bubble Production, and the Ministry of Interspecies Paperclip Allocation, to name a few. Everything on Xylar was governed by protocol, from the precise angle at which a Gillocrat was permitted to swim during the daily current commute, to the exact number of bubbles allowed per conversational sentence. Rules dictated every aspect of existence. Deviation was met with swift and merciless paperwork. And humor? Forget about it. The concept of fun was a line item in the Xylar Regulatory Codex, specifically Section 47, Paragraph 32, Subclause B, which stated, "Humor is permissible only insofar as it does not disrupt the efficient execution of bureaucratic processes," which in practice meant no humor at all. The Gillocrats were a serious bunch, dedicated to the smooth, utterly joyless operation of their aquatic civilization. And then, crashing into this perfectly ordered world like a dropped toaster in a bathtub, came Jenkins. Jenkins, bless his cotton socks, he was human. Specifically the kind of human who'd rather argue with a toaster than get up before noon. Stranded after a rather unfortunate incident involving a faulty hyperspace jump, a rogue space squid, and a distress beacon that definitely needed a firmware update, he found himself bobbing rather unceremoniously in Xylar's chilly waters. His rescue, if you could call it that, was less heroic retrieval and more efficient waste management. A squad of Gillocrat aquatic enforcement officers, their faces as stern as only a fish person in uniform can manage, scooped him up in a net and hauled him into the nearest processing center. Imagine the scene. Jenkins, clad in a slightly singed Star Trek t-shirt and cargo shorts, dripping seawater onto the impeccably clean floors of the Gillocrat Central Intake Facility. The Gillocrats surrounding him in a semicircle of shimmering disapproval, their tiny eyeglasses glinting under the bioluminescent lights. The contrast was striking. "Greetings, fish dudes," Jenkins offered, with a casual wave. "Lovely weather you're having. Bit damp though, innit?" The Gillocrats exchanged confused glances. Bubbles of consternation escaped their gills. This creature wasn't following protocol. He wasn't displaying the appropriate level of contrition for unscheduled aquatic entry, and he was smiling. The head Gillocrat, a particularly imposing specimen with extra shiny scales and a triple-strength monocle, cleared his throat, or rather expelled a series of precisely calibrated bubbles. "You are designated human. You have violated Interspecies Maritime Law, Article 7, Subsection 42B, regarding unauthorized submersion within Xylar territorial waters." Jenkins blinked. "Maritime law? Seriously? I thought that was just for pirate movies. Look, can we skip the legal jargon? I'm kinda hungry. You guys got like a cosmic McDonald's around here?" More confused glances. The head Gillocrat adjusted his monocle, a gesture that, on a human, might convey exasperation, but on a fish person, just looked slightly cross-eyed. "McDonald's is not a recognized entity within the Xylar database." Jenkins sighed. This was going to be a long visit, wasn't it? He had a feeling that explaining the concept of a cheeseburger to a room full of humorless, aquatic bureaucrats was going to be harder than escaping the space squid. Way harder. After several days of what Jenkins could only describe as aquatic bureaucracy boot camp, involving lectures on Xylar water conservation, mandatory seaweed-based meals, and filling out approximately 17,000 forms, in triplicate, he was summoned to the High Council. Human Jenkins, the head Gillocrat announced, his voice echoing through the cavernous chamber, "We have determined your unique skill set may be of use to the collective." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? I always thought my unique skill set involved napping and avoiding responsibility. But hey, I'm flexible." The Gillocrat ignored the comment, as he probably didn't get the joke. "You will be assigned to Sector 7, Subaquatic Research Facility Delta. Your designation, Observer." Sector 7 turned out to be a sprawling complex built around what the Gillocrats referred to, with hushed reverence, as the Weapon of Ultimate Deterrence. It was their most prized possession, the culmination of centuries of technological advancement and philosophical debate. In short, it was the biggest, scariest thing they had. The facility itself was a maze of corridors, pulsating with bioluminescent algae, and guarded by heavily armed Gillocrat sentinels, who eyed Jenkins with unconcealed suspicion. Every movement was monitored, every utterance recorded. It was like walking into a fish-themed Bond villain's lair, only slightly less stylish. When Jenkins finally saw the weapon, he had to admit, it was something. It stood in the center of a vast circular chamber, bathed in ethereal light. It was enormous, easily the size of a small submarine, constructed from polished chrome and bristling with intricate pipes, valves, and gauges. It hummed with barely contained power. The Gillocrats watched him expectantly, their gills fluttering with anticipation. This was it, the moment of human awe, the moment when Jenkins would finally grasp the sheer magnitude of Xylar's technological prowess. Jenkins circled the device slowly, scratching his chin. He peered at the various components, ran his hand over the smooth metal casing, and even sniffed it cautiously. Finally, he turned to the head Gillocrat with a puzzled expression. "So, what exactly does it do?" The head Gillocrat puffed out his chest, his voice filled with pride. "It is the ultimate expression of our strategic advantage. It ensures peace through the credible threat of utter obliteration." Jenkins nodded slowly, still circling. Right, obliteration, gotcha. But how?" The Gillocrat frowned, clearly struggling to dumb it down for the human. It projects a field of deterrence, so potent, so terrifying, that no sane species would ever consider aggressive action against Xylar." Jenkins paused, peering at a particularly large valve. "Yeah, but what is it? Does it shoot lasers? Does it, create a black hole? Does it sing really loudly until everyone surrenders?" The head Gillocrat spluttered. It deters. That is its function. Its form is irrelevant." Jenkins shrugged. "Well, everything has a form. I mean, even a black hole is, a hole. A really, really dark and hungry hole. But still, a hole." He tapped thoughtfully on the side of the machine. It sounded hollow, very hollow. For something so scary, it sounds kinda empty. Jenkins, left alone with the weapon, felt a familiar itch, the irresistible urge to tinker. He considered the solemn pronouncements of the Gillocrats, the hushed tones, the palpable fear, and he just couldn't resist. "Ultimate deterrence, huh?" he muttered to himself, pulling a multi-tool from his seemingly bottomless backpack. "Let's see what makes you tick." The first thing he noticed was a small access panel, hidden beneath a tangle of pipes. With a few deft twists he had it open, revealing a bewildering array of wires and tubes. "Huh," Jenkins said, peering inside. "Looks like they could use some cable management in here. And what's with all the... Is that duct tape?" He began poking around, snipping stray wires, tightening loose connections, and generally making a nuisance of himself. He had no idea what any of it did, of course, but he figured he couldn't make it any worse. "Gotta streamline this baby," he mumbled, rerouting a particularly garish green wire. "Efficiency is key, people." Unbeknownst to Jenkins, each wire, each valve, each seemingly insignificant component of the weapon was meticulously calibrated to maintain the delicate balance of deterrence. The Gillocrats had spent centuries perfecting its function, ensuring that it inspired the maximum amount of fear with the minimum amount of actual firepower. Jenkins, however, was operating under a different set of principles. His guiding philosophy could be summarized as, if it looks like it could be improved with a paperclip and some chewing gum, it probably can. He found a large, unlabeled dial, and after a moment of contemplation, decided it needed to be turned. "Gotta experiment, right?" he reasoned, giving it a hefty twist. The machine shuddered and a low hum filled the chamber. Jenkins grinned. Progress. He continued his modifications, blissfully unaware of the chaos he was about to unleash. He adjusted the water pressure, reconfigured the filtration system, and even added a small decorative rubber ducky he found in his pocket for good measure. As he worked, he imagined the Gillocrats' faces when they saw his improvements. They would be so impressed, so grateful for his initiative. He could practically hear their accolades, their praise echoing through the facility. What he didn't realize was that, with each adjustment, each modification, he was unraveling the very fabric of Xylar society. He was turning their most sacred object into, well, something else entirely, and the Gillocrats were about to find out in the most dramatic way possible. Back in the observation room, the Council of Gillocrats watched Jenkins' every move with mounting horror. Grand Overseer Krill, his gills fluttering with agitation, addressed the assembly. He is touching it with his bare appendages. Unthinkable. Another Gillocrat, a wizened elder named Phineas, croaked, "His actions defy all logic. Is this some form of aggression? A subtle declaration of war disguised as incompetence?" Their rigid, procedural minds struggled to process Jenkins' casual disregard for protocol. They had trained for centuries to maintain the weapon, to guard it with their lives, to understand its intricate mechanisms. And here was this human, treating it like a discarded toaster oven. Grand Executor Barracuda, a particularly hawkish member of the council, slammed a fin on the table. "Enough. This is clearly an act of sabotage. He is attempting to disarm our ultimate defense. We must apprehend him immediately." But Krill hesitated. But what if it is a test? A demonstration of his species' unpredictability? We cannot afford to act rashly. The debate raged on, a swirling vortex of bureaucratic indecision. Some argued for immediate capture, others for cautious observation, and still others for a full-scale investigation into Jenkins's motives, which would involve filling out no less than 17 forms in triplicate. Meanwhile, Jenkins continued, his modifications humming a jaunty tune as he worked. He was completely oblivious to the consternation he was causing, lost in his world of tinkering and improvisation. The Gillocrats, paralyzed by their own rigid logic, could only watch as their most prized possession was slowly but surely transformed into something else, something utterly incomprehensible. The tension in the observation room was thicker than the Xylarian seawater. Each click, each whir, each clank emanating from the weapon sent shivers down their spines. They knew, with growing certainty, that something terrible was about to happen, but they had no idea just how terrible, or how caffeinated. Jenkins, oblivious to the brewing storm of bureaucratic anxiety, gave the machine a final tweak. "All right, let's see what this baby can do," he muttered, slapping the side of the weapon with a resounding thunk. A series of groans, clicks, and whirs echoed through the chamber as the machine shuddered to life. Pipes rattled, valves hissed, and a low, guttural hum filled the air. The Gillocrats watched in petrified silence, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. This was it, the moment of ultimate something. Suddenly, a spout on the side of the machine whirred open, and a dark, steaming liquid gurgled forth, filling the air with a rich, earthy aroma. It wasn't the smell of ozone or hypercompressed plasma, or any of the other terrifying scents they had associated with the weapon. It smelled strangely familiar, comfortingly warm. Grand Overseer Krill, ever the cautious one, tentatively extended a fin and dipped it into the liquid. He brought it to his mouth, hesitated for a moment, then took a tentative sip. His eyes widened. He took another larger sip and then another. A look of utter bewilderment spread across his face. But this is coffee? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Jenkins beamed, oblivious to the monumental revelation he had just unleashed. Yep, freshly brewed. I noticed you guys looked a little tired, so I figured I'd give your doomsday device a little upgrade. Needed a better filter, though. The old one was leaving grounds in it, you know? The other Gillocrats, still reeling from the shock of Krill's pronouncement, cautiously approached the machine and followed his example. They dipped their fins, they sipped, they savored. And then, one by one, their faces mirrored Krill's initial disbelief, followed by a dawning sense of understanding. Coffee? Grand Executor Barracuda croaked, his voice filled with incredulity. The weapon of ultimate deterrence is a coffee machine? Jenkins chuckled. Well, yeah. Didn't you guys? No, I thought it was pretty obvious. All those pipes and filters, the heating element. Plus, I found a whole stash of coffee beans in the storage room. Kinda gave it away. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle gurgling of the coffee machine. The Gillocrats stared at each other, their rigid, militaristic worldview crumbling before their very eyes. Their most sacred object, the symbol of their power and authority, was nothing more than a ridiculously oversized caffeine dispenser. The truth, as Jenkins had so casually revealed, was almost too absurd to comprehend. The weapon of ultimate deterrence wasn't designed to obliterate their enemies. It was designed to fuel their endless paperwork, to keep their bureaucratic machine churning day and night, to maintain the rigid order of Xylarian society through sheer, unadulterated caffeine. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. All the reverence, all the security measures, all the centuries of tradition for a cup of joe. The weight of their collective delusion crashed down upon them, leaving them gasping for air in the now coffee-scented chamber. The implications were staggering. Their entire culture, their entire way of life was built on a lie, or at the very least a profound misunderstanding, and it had all been revealed by a human who just wanted a decent cup of coffee. The revelation hit the Gillocrats like a shot of pure espresso, ironic considering the source. Their meticulously structured reality, built on layers of protocol and reverence, began to crack and crumble like a stale kelp biscuit. The weapon of ultimate deterrence, the symbol of their power, was nothing more than a giant gurgling coffee pot. Grand Overseer Krill, the first to taste the forbidden brew, felt a strange warmth spread through his cold-blooded veins. It wasn't the warmth of fear, or the burning sensation of righteous anger. It was pleasant. He felt a twitch in his normally stoic face, a flicker of something suspiciously like amusement. But not all Gillocrats were ready to embrace the absurdity. Grand Executor Barracuda, a staunch traditionalist with scales as rigid as his principles, sputtered in disbelief. "Heresy," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This is an outrage. The weapon, reduced to a common beverage dispenser? Unacceptable." The news spread like wildfire through the aquatic city. Gillocrats emerged from their bureaucratic warrens, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity. Some rushed to the weapon, eager to sample the forbidden coffee. Others barricaded themselves in their offices, clinging to the old ways. A schism began to form, dividing Xylarian society along caffeine-fueled lines. The Traditionalists, led by Barracuda, denounced the coffee as a dangerous intoxicant, a threat to their rigid social order. They called for its immediate banishment and the reinstatement of the weapon's original, albeit imaginary, purpose. The progressives, emboldened by Krill's newfound openness and the invigorating effects of the coffee, embraced the absurdity with open fins. They argued that the weapon's true purpose, to fuel their society, was still being served, albeit in a far more enjoyable way. They began experimenting with different blends and brewing methods, turning the once sacred chamber into a makeshift coffee bar. Jenkins, meanwhile, watched the unfolding chaos with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, scratching his head. "Didn't expect a little coffee to cause a full-blown cultural revolution. Guess these guys were really overdue for a caffeine break." He found himself caught between the two factions, an unwitting symbol of their conflicting ideologies. The Traditionalists saw him as a dangerous iconoclast, a destroyer of their sacred traditions. The Progressives hailed him as a liberator, a bringer of enlightenment, and delicious coffee. The conflict escalated as the coffee supply dwindled. The Gillocrats, now thoroughly addicted to the caffeinated beverage, began to experience withdrawal symptoms, jitters, irritability, and a desperate craving for that sweet, dark nectar. Arguments erupted in the bureaucratic warrens. Paperwork went unfinished and the city ground to a halt. The rigid order of Xylarian society teetered on the brink of collapse, all thanks to a giant coffee machine and one very confused human. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. The Gillocrats, fueled by caffeine and a newfound sense of rebellion, started to question the very foundations of their society. They challenged the rigid protocols, the endless paperwork, the stifling conformity that had defined their lives for centuries. They began to laugh. They laughed at the absurdity of their traditions, at the futility of their endless bureaucracy, at the fact that their weapon of ultimate deterrence was nothing more than a glorified coffee maker. And in that laughter, a seed of change was planted. The pressure had been building for days. The weapon, now operating at full capacity to meet the insatiable demand for caffeine, began to groan and shudder. Pipes vibrated, valves rattled, and the air filled with the pungent aroma of overbrewed coffee. It was only a matter of time before something gave. And then it did. With a deafening roar that echoed across the city, the main brewing chamber of the giant coffee machine ruptured. A torrent of scalding, highly caffeinated coffee erupted from the weapon, flooding the chamber and cascading down into the city streets. The capital of Xylar was awash in coffee. Gillocrats were swept away by the sudden surge, their meticulously ordered lives turned upside down. Literally. Buildings were submerged, bureaucratic warrens became swirling pools of coffee, and the city's rigid structure dissolved into a sticky, caffeinated mess. At first there was panic. Gillocrats thrashed and sputtered, struggling to stay afloat in the unexpected deluge. The Traditionalists, seeing this as divine retribution for their coffee-fueled heresy, wailed and gnashed their teeth. The Progressives, initially stunned, quickly realized the potential of the situation. It was a coffee party of epic proportions. Fueled by the massive caffeine infusion, the Gillocrats were thrown into a frenzy of activity. They swam through the streets, whooping and hollering, their usually placid faces contorted in expressions of wild excitement. They danced and splashed in the coffee-filled plazas, their rigid routines completely abandoned. Paperwork, once the lifeblood of Xylarian society, was now used as makeshift rafts and coffee filters. Bureaucratic offices transformed into impromptu swimming pools, and the city's normally somber atmosphere was replaced with the joyful chaos of a caffeine-fueled carnival. Grand Overseer Krill, riding atop a floating stack of abandoned tax forms, let out a hearty bellow of laughter. "More coffee!" he cried, his voice echoing through the flooded city. "Let the paperwork drown, let the bureaucracy crumble. Today, we celebrate coffee." Grand Executor Barracuda, still clinging to a submerged flagpole, watched the scene with horror. "This is madness," he shrieked, his voice barely audible above the din. "Anarchy! The end of civilization as we know it." But even Barracuda couldn't resist the intoxicating effects of the coffee for long. As the caffeine coursed through his veins, he felt a strange sensation. a loosening of his rigid principles, a flicker of joy. He let go of the flagpole, took a deep breath, and plunged into the coffee-filled streets, joining the revelry, with a surprisingly enthusiastic splash. Jenkins, standing on a partially submerged bureaucratic building and watching the coffee-soaked chaos unfold, threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a deep, genuine laugh, the kind that rattled his ribs and brought tears to his eyes. He realized the sheer absurdity of it all, how a simple misunderstanding, a mistranslation of galactic proportions, had shattered the foundations of an entire civilization. The Gillocrats, initially bewildered by Jenkins' outburst, paused in their caffeinated revelry to stare at him. Their large, fishy eyes blinked in confusion, unsure how to process this strange human reaction. Was this some sort of elaborate victory dance? A sign of utter madness? Then slowly, hesitantly, a few of them began to chuckle. A small giggle escaped a young Gillocrat, followed by a snort from an elder. Soon, the chuckles grew into full-blown laughter, echoing through the coffee-filled streets. They understood, finally, the humor in their rigid adherence to tradition, the ridiculousness of their coffee-powered bureaucracy. They were laughing at themselves. Grand Overseer Krill, still perched atop his floating stack of tax forms, let out another booming laugh, a sound that shook the very foundations of the submerged buildings. "He is laughing at death," Krill exclaimed, wiping a tear from his eye. "And the irony of our existence, and I must agree it is very funny." Even Grand Executor Barracuda, now completely submerged but bobbing back to the surface, sputtered with laughter, coffee dribbling from his gills. "By the great filter," he wheezed, "it appears we have been taking ourselves far too seriously." The laughter spread like wildfire through the city, washing away the remnants of their rigid formality. They laughed at the coffee, they laughed at the chaos, they laughed at their own absurdity. For the first time in Xylarian history, they were laughing at death and bureaucracy. Jenkins packed his meager belongings, a smirk playing on his lips. Xylar was a little less rigid, a little more caffeinated than when he'd arrived. He'd left a mark, all right, a coffee stain perhaps on the pristine fabric of their bureaucratic existence. The Gillocrats, forever changed by his accidental intervention, started incorporating a moment of absurdity into their daily routines. Every day at precisely 1400 hours, all bureaucratic work would cease for 5 minutes. During this time, Gillocrats were encouraged to tell jokes, make silly faces, or contemplate the meaninglessness of existence, all fueled, of course, by copious amounts of coffee. Jenkins became a legendary figure on Xylar, celebrated and ridiculed in equal measure. Some hailed him as a visionary, a liberator who had freed them from the shackles of their own seriousness. Others saw him as a chaotic agent, a reckless fool who had nearly destroyed their civilization with a giant coffee machine. Regardless, his image was immortalized in Xylarian art, a small, unimpressive human, perpetually grinning, often depicted riding a giant coffee bean. Jenkins, oblivious to his newfound infamy, hitched a ride on a passing freighter, whistling a jaunty tune. Xylar was just a stepping stone, another bizarre chapter in his intergalactic misadventures. He was ready to move on, ready to cause more havoc, more laughter, more cultural misunderstandings in some other unsuspecting corner of the universe. After all, there were plenty more overly serious alien civilizations out there just waiting for a good dose of absurdity. And Jenkins, the accidental agent of chaos, was just toe